As I said, I'm Professor Andy McDonnell. This is the first of a series of webinars. We hope to be holding a free webinar from the Studio 3 team, not just me, I should stress, over the next 6 months. I know with the whole issue around COVID that we're all experiencing and the uncertainty, there's a lot of anxiety about it. And it may seem a bit daunting to some people to say that we're going to be running free webinars for 6 months. Well, part of the plan is we're going to continue running them as part of our gesture to community and keeping people connected forever. This for us is a necessary step with COVID, but it's also a way of getting us connected. So this is the first of a number. I'll have an announcement at the end about our next 2 speakers over the next few weeks. And we hope you enjoy this. We hope you interact with it. And as Sean has pointed out, at the end of this talk, I'll be answering questions live to video. Again, you're not all expected to necessarily stay on for 2 hours afterwards, but I will be sitting here for the best part of 2 hours, live answering questions that come up on the screen that the team think we can answer straight away. So without much further ado, and with a passionate fear of technology, I will now share my screen with you, and we will begin the talk. So the theme of the talk is called A Low Arousal Approach, a Practitioner's Guide. This is loosely based on my most recent book, which is called The Reflective Journey, a Practitioner's Guide to the Low Arousal Approach. And within that book, really I've outlined the construct from its early beginnings in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which was very much focused on crisis management only, to where it is today, which is much more, as somebody has described to me, a philosophical approach to managing crises, but much broader about how we manage stress and those constructs that come with that. So obviously the reflective journey is something that's been a culmination of my work. I don't claim to own the term low arousal, I want to be clear. Well, I did coin the term in the 1990s, but the term itself really kind of labels a philosophy that goes back to its early roots in Buddhism, mindfulness practice, meditation. But the key issue, and the reason why I called the book The Reflective Journey, is so much about low arousal is about us, not the people we support. You know, in a crisis, you're more likely to be able to control your own behavior than you are trying to wish that the person changes their behavior. So what I'm going to do today as part of this talk is focus on some aspects of this that are particularly not well known. Like I said, this whole idea about reflective practice, about it's all about us and not them, is a huge part of this. And I'm going to separate that out near the end of the talk from what you do in the immediate crisis mode. And one thing I'd like to say to the audience, first of all, is when I started out in this work, and I don't claim that I'm the world's expert on everything with it, I was appalled as a clinical psychologist working with people with disabilities at the time, that the evidence for what you do in a crisis, you could put in a thimble. People would tell me you can play dead if somebody's upset, you can do X, you can do Y, you can do planned escape, but actually not a lot of evidence for those approaches. And one of the things that affected me as a psychologist, and I was trained in applied behavior analysis, I was trained in cognitive therapy and then systems work, was that the toolkit I was given didn't really help me when I was working with families, both children and adults, and they wanted advice on what to do day to day. I remember one parent saying to me very angrily in the early 90s, as I sat across from her with my tweed jacket on and a beard, because I tried to look older then, because I was young, and how can you give advice to people who are almost your parents' age about behavior unless you look the part? But I remember this parent saying in anger, well, what you do, you try taking him to Tesco's and see what he's like when he's absolutely going crazy. And that's really where my journey started the next stage, because as a psychologist, I decided maybe I'm doing the wrong things here. I can write them a plan, but they don't believe me. And I can write them a plan about crisis management, but they don't believe me. So really, the whole concept was very, very, very much in its infancy in the late 80s and early 90s, which moved us on to something that was much more akin to focusing on crisis management in detail. In 1998, without pushing it too far, the first published paper that I published on a case study around low arousal was on a man without autism who lived in an institution. It was a locked, secure ward. And obviously what we did in that situation is we got staff to reduce and change their behavior, not his. And the message at the time was, we must alter our behavior. So the original definition, which has been changed over the years, has this as its heart. And I said, attempts to alter staff behavior, and for staff also read parent, carer, by avoiding confrontational situations and seeking the path of least resistance. Now that sounds like a very simple construct, I'm sure, to anyone listening to this. Some of these people on this webinar I know are familiar with the approach. others are less familiar. So I'll try and balance why that is such a mindset shift for people. You know, I'm saying, I'm not going to look at this person's behavior, I'm going to target my own. We're all parents, many of us are, many of us have siblings, many of us live in a culture where we've lost our temper, we've got angry. But in our field, and this also includes looked after children, mental health, often when somebody's behavior escalates because of stress, it's their behavior we try to alter, not ours. So one of the key fundamental principles of this whole idea of low arousal is it's about us, not them, which I'm going to come back to later in the talk. So moving on, here's the latest kind of definition. I have a colleague who I'm aware might be on this talk who says that I keep changing definitions as the concept evolves and construct evolves, and he's probably right. But if we're talking about what low arousal means in practice, just to simplify it to the layman, to the person out there, what it means is in a crisis, you make your arousal signature minimal and low. So you minimize verbal interaction. The classic mantra is speak less, not more. Most of you will notice when you've been in crisis situations at home and at work, the more nervous you get, the more you talk. The more you talk, the more the stressed person doesn't understand what it is you expect them to do. So fundamentally around verbal interaction, in a crisis, it means less is more. It does not mean go like a Trappist monk for the rest of your life. I remember working with a young man who was a support worker. He's now a qualified psychologist in a mental health service in the Republic of Ireland. I think the last time he contacted me was 10 years ago because I recruited him into one of the first supported living schemes I set up in Birmingham. We were short of staff. People were struggling with the approach. They were struggling with doing less and minimizing verbal interaction. And I got called out one night. We had pagers in those days. And I arrived at the house and the service user, I hate the word high functioning, I'll change his name to John. He actually came out and met me and said, this staff member's really weird. And I said, well, why, John? And he said, he doesn't say anything. He just sits in the chair and he's it's like his tongue's been cut out. When I brought the young man outside, I realized that what he had taken from our early training was say nothing. So the word minimize verbal interaction is very important in this. Reducing environmental arousal, this is something that a lot of people think they understand. Think about noise, light, crowding, heat even, and other environmental variables, having a quiet area. But sometimes I've been to special schools, for example, where people tell me, we use a low arousal approach. Do you want to see our quiet room? That to me isn't low arousal. That's weaponizing something into something completely different. But that's for another talk on another day. I think one of the largest areas of concern for me about the approach was the immediate crisis management, space, gesture, speed of movement, touch, even how you breathe and how you relax yourself in the moment. And I feel over the years that people have often misunderstood this because staff, carers, family will often tell me, we know how to do this. But I'm sure most of you watching this presentation will know already, we're not very good at it. In the moment, when we melt down, we can end up saying things, doing things caused by our own stress and fear and panic that actually just exacerbate situations. But the positive message is, if our behavior can escalate a situation, then changing our behavior can massively de-escalate a situation. And that's why he says humbly, with my staff and my colleagues and supporters of the approach, we feel we've been quite successful over the years. The other area is to talk about being aware of your own beliefs around behavior. If you have beliefs, and I'm going to talk about this later, that are quite firm, classic example is spare the rod, not the child, that's going to drive what you do in those situations. Quite often I've seen people raise their voices, particularly with children, try to take control of the situation verbally and non-verbally, and sometimes physically. And the approach is actually saying you need to be aware that you're not trying to correct behavior when someone is literally melting down and in crisis. What you're doing is trying to go with the flow and ride out the storm. And the last bit, which is in my book, is that to be really good at this over time, it's a skill that I think most people can learn. You have to be reflective. You have to be inward looking. You have to look at your own behavior and say, how did that interaction go this time? Can I improve it next time? So that really summarizes the approach, and I probably haven't done it as much justice, but I'm very aware that we should all be on the same sheet of paper here for this talk at the moment. So the other thing that I'm going to focus on primarily today is a little less alone about the techniques and what you do. I'll do a bit later on. I always have to, how you stand, how you apply this. But I'm really going to focus on a key question, which is about us and people watching this, which is fundamentally, what is a low arousal practitioner? You know, people I see who I label as good practitioners, they're often passionate about, engaging people. They're very person-centered. They're often passionately against restraint, seclusion, use of sanctions, consequences. Um, and they buy into the mantra that behavior is complex and you need to be able to manage your behavior first before you change your behavior. The analogy for me is very simple. We talk an awful lot about proactive approaches, which is very good and important in our approach. You know, fix the stress and fix the structures around a person. Don't just concentrate on the crisis. But let's just say you're in the fire brigade and the house is on fire. Would you say right then, sorry, the wiring in the house was faulty, everything else is wrong with the house, I'll just let it burn down? So for us, crisis management, when we're looking at low arousal practitioners, are people who can be in the moment with people who are quite distressing and quite distressed. And I think one of the things we're going to focus on later on, again, when we're looking at our own behavior, is that we know that things like stress and fear and other concepts like emotional concepts are contagious. It's quite interesting when you're thinking about the COVID crisis at the moment. We're scaring ourselves by watching the news and media, and I'm not minimizing how serious the situation is. However, fear transmit across through your TV screens with the latest death statistics. But the opposite of fear that you can encourage is confidence and courage and calm. And these are things that sometimes are hard to project for people when they're looking at these approaches. So I'm not saying every practitioner is the same, but we borrow heavily on who we are as people. And I'm going to focus something on positive psychologists such as Martin Seligman, who really introduced originally the idea of character strengths, looking in terms of positive psychology about not just your weaknesses, but what your strengths are. And he came up originally with a researcher called Peterson with 15, initially 15, and it went up to 24 character strengths. More recently, a colleague of ours, Ryan Nemec, has argued for what he calls strengths-based therapeutic approaches. Now, just as a plug and a recommendation, this is one website on here that I just indicated, but there are others. There are character strengths tests that you can do. And I strongly urge anyone who watches it, no matter what sector you work in and what you do, to do a little self-assessment exercise of your character strengths. It's quite revealing what comes over in it. But without binding self completely to character strengths, I've selected some of these that fit within the low arousal approach. And that fits also within what our values are. Yeah. And how do we recognize practitioners? Because as I keep telling people, low arousal practitioners come in all shapes and sizes. They're philosophically, they share some very similar values, but they can also be very different. So out of the character strengths so far, to give you an example, and I'm not going to talk about this at too much length today, but there'll be plenty of time in the future. I've taken some of the character strengths from Martin Seligman that I think are particularly important around a low arousal approach. And I'm not saying this is an exhaustive list, but I do think there are things that I see with people who are expected to ride out the storm, are expected to sometimes take a step back with people who are distressed. And some of those include compassion. People talk about compassion fatigue. It's amazing how we change something into a negative from a positive. Compassion is something that you need to have. And with that compassion also comes empathy, of course. If you can't walk a mile in the person's shoes and understand the stress and trauma that they may be going through, then it's going to affect your response to them. Forgiveness, I've had to do it in my job and career. I have been kicked, punched, spat on in my career. I'm talking about mostly the people with the diagnosis, but others too. To move on from that, you have to be able to forgive people. And I don't mean that in some kind of cliche North American way. So often people that I see who are good low arousal practitioners, they refer to things as blips. I remember a colleague of mine saying once, oh, we took so-and-so out to the supermarket. Yeah, it didn't go so great. We had a bit of a blip. When I actually asked them, well, what was a blip? The person literally threw cans down from the shelf. They had a complete meltdown. My colleagues had to get the public out of the way. They had to create space. The police arrived. They created space. Eventually, the person calmed down and they went back to their supported living service. But they referred to that as a blip. And I remember saying to one of my colleagues, have we overdone this minimizing behavior thing? Because that was more than a blip to me. That sounded like a nightmare they went through. But truly, they very confidently managed it. And I think what that showed as well is they were acting very bravely. We talk about fear, but the opposite of fear is courage. We're seeing a lot of courageous behavior at the moment from people. So with that comes also the idea that I've added to this, which is not so much it's in the character strengths, which is self-regulation and particularly co-regulation. If you can't regulate your own arousal in a situation, you bring work in, you're not in the right frame of mind, you're on your mobile phone, which is another big one, and you're distracted, how can you expect to model regulation to others? Rather than saying, I'm going to teach you to self-regulate, it starts with yourself again and your own self-regulation. The other thing I find in this approach is that people need to be as honest as they can possibly be and open. We're all going to come across situations where we might have been hurt or frightened or scared. Often our core beliefs and responses to that is we want to fix that or do something about it. Or in some other areas that we work in, you get the idea of restorative justice or consequences or sanctions. So honesty is another characteristic I think is essential in low arousal practitioners. From their term, I use the term social intelligence, and I would actually put social and emotional intelligence to broaden it a little bit. You know, what's your own emotional literacy? You know, if you're working with someone who's developmentally young, for example, or has been traumatized and really is struggling to engage with people, they may say some particularly horrendous and abusive things to you. So social intelligence is about understanding that and having the emotional literacy to take a step back. And I think the last one is fairness. We often, when we have too much power over people, do things that are unfair that we justify as part of a behavior support plan or an approach. We're forcing and coercing people, sometimes unintentionally. So one of the drivers to understanding what makes a good low arousal practitioner is a couple of things that are in my book. One of them, which is about understanding your own stress. This is a very good image from one of my colleagues. She's an actress. I think she encapsulates stress and distress very well in her images. So if we're going to think about stress responses, quite often, again, I hear people say to me, well, I know about stress and I know about anxiety. I prefer, and my colleagues prefer the term stress because it's transactional in nature. My stress affects your stress stress affects my stress, the environmental stress affects all of us. Rather than anxiety, which often in my field and other fields that are similar, we tend to park or place in the person. I need to fix your anxiety problem. I need to fix your OCD. But what we see when people are stressed, and we know that stress is triggered by excessive demands, which outweigh our coping responses, it's a balancing act between the two. We also know that distressed individuals, and we include us in this, are more vigilant to threats. You know, we can sometimes perceive, and I think perceive is the important word, not actual, perceive things as major threats or stressors. Yeah. But we also know that as an individual's threat response reduces in their stress, they become less vigilant to future threats. So these are some oversimplifications from the literature and as practitioners that we already know. In addition to that, when we're stressed, I find in my work, we struggle with the idea of control in situations. A good example recently was somebody said, well, we're not restraining this guy. He's an adult with mental health issues anymore, but he threw things at us and we withdrew from the room. My answer to that was yes. And one of the members of staff, using honesty and that character strength, said to me, but he's getting away with it and he's in control when he's doing this. And my answer was very simple. Well, no, you've controlled the situation by keeping people safe and reducing arousal. What I find is when people are in these situations, they often unintentionally and unaware of the fact of how much they try to control people. I remember many years ago when I was as I refer to it, crazy behaviorist in the early days. I was out there fixing everything and writing plans that quite often people never read. I would write an awful lot of controlling things there of shoulds and do's and don'ts that I would give to the client, service user, like it was some kind of medical prescription. I should stress as well in other talks that I managed to move away from that over time by reflecting on it and realizing I'm actually over controlling people in these situations. But actually to have less control over situation or perceive less control is actually more frightening for people when they're supporting it. That's why often I believe that restraint often happens inappropriately because people are trying to contain a situation for the person's safety, but also for their own stress and fear response. So within this idea is the idea of a battle for control. And a few years ago with my colleague, Professor David Dagnan, we designed a scale that's been used in older adults and disability services called the Controllability Belief Scale. And it's basically 50 questions. It's available online. These questions either ask somebody to think about an individual in general or a recent incident of challenging behavior, and then they're asked to rapidly answer questions on a kind of Likert scale of agree, disagree. So we've adapted this even further, and I'm telling you all this now clinically, where we actually put the person's name in it and to a particular situation, and we give these questionnaires out to staff and carers. But I picked some of these, which are about willfulness. So I picked out the willfulness questions. So let's just imagine you're imagining a situation where someone has thrown something of you, been verbally abusive. It could be at work, it could be at home. then think about these questions and don't go think about them and kind of intellectualize them too much. When they did X, were they trying to deliberately wind me up? Agree, strongly disagree, disagree. They're doing it deliberately. They know what they're doing. They could stop if they wanted. All of these questions often place control within the person. And what we know from psychological research is the more we perceive a threat from someone, the more we perceive they're in control, the more we'll feel either manipulated, the more we'll feel frightened and scared, and the more likely we are to either avoid or in care situations actually control and contain. I recommend the scale to you. We'll certainly send you some of the individualized ones that we've done with people, and we find it a modest, as I refer to it as a colleague, but useful tool that people can use. We also know that over control and why it's so important leads to sanctions and consequences. Now, we can say there's natural consequences for people, but we need to be careful about that. And that's for another talk on another day. You know, the natural consequence to me not understanding how a cooker works would be to burn myself as part of a learning process. I think basically the idea is that consequential based behavior often gets confused with sanctions and restrictions. And often we do them in a very reactive way. And I would say very positively as a low arousal practitioner, most of the people I work with and support, they're trying their best in very difficult circumstances. Yeah, there's a colleague of ours, Ross Green in America, who wrote a book called The Explosive Child, who often refers to kids in these situations as they're trying their best. They're just kind of screwing up, really. So we mustn't see them as people with a plan to ruin our lives. And if you see people as stressed, traumatized, and vulnerable, then actually it increases your likelihood that you're going to respond in an appropriate and calm manner to them. And you're going to want to avoid sanctions. I spend a lot of my job having meetings with staff who sometimes they're frightened or they're stressed, and some of their immediate reactions is to want sanctions and consequences. But by the time they've talked it through, calmed down and reflected, often it doesn't become an issue. You know, I think another construct that's important as low arousal practitioners is empathy. And I'm not going to go into the technology behind it and some of the debates about definitions, but the idea about empathizing with someone is a core part of being person-centered. If I can't see the person, I can't empathize with them, I'm going to struggle. I remember somebody saying to me recently that they were working with older adults using the low arousal approach. And they argued that it was much easier to teach staff who work in elderly services and older adult services because they can all say, I'm going to be a customer one day. I'm going to be sitting in that same chair as Doris or John that I'm just working with right now. Whereas for other conditions, ADHD, other conditions like that, autism, certain issues of trauma, sometimes people struggle to empathize with those approaches. And that leads us with a problem about making an emotional connection with someone. One thing I'd also like to point out about empathy, and this comes from some autism research by my colleague, Damien Milton, he often refers to empathy as a two-way street as well, which is a wonderful concept, which he calls the double empathy problem. You know, the problem isn't you empathizing with me, the problem is me empathizing with you. And I think it's a fantastic way to look at the low arousal practitioners again. You know, when we talk about trauma awareness and trauma-informed approaches, what we're talking about is encouraging people to empathize with individuals. Another variable that people just don't talk at all in this field is I see work on stress, I see work on anxiety. People don't like using the fear word. I have worked in this job a long time, and there have been situations, and I consider myself to be quite a confident person, where I have been fearful. And I encourage people who are practitioners of the low arousal approach to talk about their fears. It doesn't necessarily resolve it all. We have a good example now about COVID, too much and too little conversation. But I encourage people to say, what is the fear? What is the concern? Well, the concern is I might die, or my relatives that I care about might die. So actually talking about fear is something culturally that we find that people struggle with to a great deal. And we know that when people are fearful, you know, this can lead to panic responses. I just want to point one thing out in this slide from my colleague Daniel Rippon, who's a lecturer at the University of Northumbria in the course something called the Stress Research Group, which is an organisation with Professor Mark Wetherall and Michael Smith. We have quite a strong link from Studio 3 with that group, and I encourage you to look at their work in a lot more detail. Daniel did a study where he actually interviewed staff who work with people with challenges in disabilities, autism and other services, but in community and what you might call more closed settings. And one of the things that he isolated from people's responses was sometimes people feel isolated at work, which increases their fear. Lone working was a good example of that. But often with some of the people we work with, lone working is safer, but it's not perceived as safer. I might say, well, if I'm working one-to-one with you, I can be more focused on this interaction and it's less complicated. This is normally true. But if you come from a culture where you have 2 or 3 staff who are backing you up in the corner, conversations are going on in a very confusing way, it's not necessarily the most appropriate response in low arousal. Often we say, again, less is more with staff as well. But critically, understanding these fear responses is a cornerstone to what we're about. And I just want to finish with this idea about where we are, even with our training in Studio 3, which is on crisis management as well. And we do literally teach people approaches to what to do in very difficult situations. I just want to remind people, just from this one slide, that the opposite of fear is confidence and courage. And these transmit just as easily as fear does stress and trauma. So we need to think about this transaction as a two-way street. And I want to finish some of the characteristics to start with on anger. And when I talk about anger, people talk about everyday anger. We know that anger has survival value, but they speak about it in this kind of very strange tones. What we look at is that if you've been scratched, bitten, abused, verbally shouted at, called every name under the sun, you're going to often arouse, no matter how good you think you are, emotions of anger. And I actually see in my work quite a lot, and the reason why I mention it is that anger doesn't lead to acceptance and understanding. And often it means that we perceive the person as controlling, and often we want to do something to that person. And that's because it's escalated our own stress or trauma. So anger itself, again, we require people to be honester in a low arousal approach. We need them to be honest, yeah, and totally honest, not saying, I don't get angry with people. One of the first bits of work I ever did with groups of staff, and I'm going back to the 80s and 90s, was to ask people if they felt angry after somebody had bitten or scratched them. And the most common response was, I'm okay, no. But it didn't fit with the reality. It's normal to have an angry response to someone. It's normal to have a fearful response. It's not normal to let it persist. But what we need to do is normalize conversation about these things. You know? And I think one of the things that we're going to finish with this idea of the concepts, and I hope I've given you a very short introduction to the approach and some of the things about what makes a practitioner. I am always going to finish with the idea of what do you do in the moment? What do you do when things are melting down? What do you do when people are saying, I can't cope, the person's very stressful, people are throwing objects at me? I was once asked and I'm not trying to be melodramatic, have you ever been threatened with a knife? The answer is yes. How did you feel? Scared, frightened, terrified. And I don't really reveal it, but the other reason why I got into this work is that I taught a martial art jiu-jitsu for 30 years. And I want to say I don't believe people with those kind of backgrounds should be advising people in care unless they understand the care context. In martial arts terms, when you're managing a crisis, it's about mind over matter. You don't mind what you do because they don't matter. You're trying to defend yourself. This is not about self-defense in a crisis. This is about supporting someone through a very difficult, distressing time. So I quote Kipling, or misquoting quite often, which he often, in If the poem, he said, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs, to paraphrase. My argument is if you can keep your head when all about those are losing theirs, you're a very special person. Most of us at some time or other will panic. So the idea around the approach in immediate crisis management, and this is where I think we're going to be doing more work in the future in our organization, because people are taking this for granted that they're good at these things that are on the list of slides that I'm going to show you now. And our experience is people aren't. People really struggle with being in the moment when they're stressed, when they're frightened, and they're scared. So that my favorite phrase that people use is appear calm. I like that phrase because it means appear calm. Look calm to the person. Don't communicate distress or arousal. Look chilled and laid back, but it doesn't mean inside that you are calm. And I think sometimes people have misconstrued our approach to saying, be calm. It says, appear to be calm. Everything should be slowing down. You know, when we're frightened and scared, our movements become quicker. Our sense of space, which I'm going to talk to, you know, really increase. Our breathing becomes more rapid. We are in a transactional situation with somebody or a group of individual, and we will communicate that fear to them and vice versa. And if you're somebody who's developmentally young or somebody who's traumatized, sometimes you may pick up on that emotion without having any sense of what's going on for you or the other person. You'll just get frightened or scared yourself. Often we'll talk about removing direct eye contact with people and physical contact. This does not mean forever. It just means in the moment when somebody's really, really, really exacerbated. Quite a few years ago, I can't say where, I was training some police officers in de-escalation. It's not something I would choose to do regularly. It did challenge me and my own hippie beliefs. And we did some what we call intensive role play. And while I was shouting and swearing, and actually enjoying shouting and swearing at a serving police officer, At the moment, I briefly touched him by his arm. At the moment of touch, several police officers stood up in this seminar, even though they knew it was a role play, and started walking towards me and saying, he's gone hands on. And this is about different responses in different sectors. I understand that a policeman may well be someone who has to respond in a particular way, in a team way to that. But you can't apply that to the vulnerable and to care. And actually, I think in many situations with policing, I've met very empathic, sensitive police officers who are actually low arousal practitioners, and they don't rush in those situations. Reducing eye contact, because we know it's so physiological arousing, is really important. Direct eye contact really raises your physiology and your arousal response. What people do understand is reducing verbal demands and cues and environmental demands, but that's only a certain component of the low arousal approach. One of the first things I always remind people in a crisis situation, whether you're in a group or others, is if possible, remove onlookers, not the person themselves. One of the things that drives me really, really crazy in school situations is there's almost a culture sometimes of removing the child if they're being disruptive to a quiet area or a quiet zone. No, stop the lesson. You're already going to have it disrupted anyway. Practice planned escape, which we're going to come on to later. Let everyone evacuate the classroom. You would for a fire drill. But often people struggle to do that, not because of resourcing, but because another characteristic around the low arousal approach is it can sometimes feel like you're giving in to the person and you're ending into a win-lose situation. But removing onlookers is a very powerful way to reduce arousal, because we know group effects are very strong around arousal. If you are arguing in front of a group of people, you can see this in pubs and clubs when you're out and about, you're more likely to do things differently to if it's a one-to-one communication. So the other element to this is that it can be traumatizing and sometimes exciting for people to witness verbal and physical aggression. So you'll see people want to watch. You're all familiar with the term rubbernecking on motorways, that somebody's been in an accident and cars slow down to look. Even those are not bad people, but they're drawn towards the spectacle. Yeah. And often we find that this adds around to sort of the situation. So it's again a very simple tip that the first thing we do is to try and minimize things and remove other people. If you've got a second member of staff, get them out of line of sight. Please do not engage in that way. Avoiding verbal arguments, and this is a very common thing we're asked, very hard to do ourselves. I want to be clear here again, I'm no saint. We're all capable of arguing with people. I'm just saying when you go to work, we can get better at not arguing with people, particularly who are distressed, and we should be better at it. Doesn't mean to say that we'll never argue with people, but often we'll challenge people. You know, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. Who said this? Who said that? Our mantra is very, very simple. We say, when in doubt, shut your mouth. If you're not sure, walk out the door in an argument. We do find that people tend to over-engage emotionally. They get into a tit for tat. You said this, no, I said that. No, you said this, no, I said that. I remember some research years ago that looking at domestic violence, which showed the most common argument between couples was arguments over turn-taking in domestic activities. And this led to violence. This led to women being assaulted by men. So we need to understand that that escalation model is about this urge to feel like you win in everyday arguments. Low arousal practitioners don't actually care in the moment whether they win or lose. And you have to have this dialogue with yourself to say, does this really matter? Is this argument pointless? Although I must say, many years ago, my son, who's now a doctor, he's out there at the moment working in A&E in this country, he had an argument with me when he was a teenager. I still cannot remember to this day what the argument was about. It was one of those parent control things, being a hypocrite. I'm at home, I'm your dad. You know, you'll tell me when you're going out somewhere. It was something along those lines. And I got quite annoyed with him and quite angry. And in the midst of the argument, he held up my original book, which is green, thrust it into my face and said, "Have you read your own book, Dad?" It was the best put down I've ever had in my entire life. I didn't know what to say. He walked out the door, and after my anger abated, I realized I couldn't even remember what the argument was about. And what a brilliant way to shut me down and stop me going on at him about something that was probably pretty pointless to a teenager who was turbocharged on hormones at the time. But you've got to get over this win-lose thing. And that is contextually driven. I have different relationships with different people. So I'm more likely to be more accommodating to a friend who I'm close to who swears or shouts at me than to someone I don't necessarily like or get on with. And again, these are some of the other hidden things that really emerge when we're talking about the practice of low arousal in reality. The other thing about non-verbal cues, now I use this, and yes, for some of you watching this, this is me, it's in my recent book. Look at this image and stare at these eyes for a few seconds. Stare into them deeply. Now that look has something that has saved me on many occasions outside of the care context. Yeah. That look of hostility, and staring, even though I've been terrified in time. For those of you, when we do these talks in the summer, I might tell you the nearest I came to getting seriously harmed at a football match by my own supporters. I can't say which team, Newcastle United many years ago, but that look actually probably got me out of the situation. I looked aggressive. Inside, I was terrified. But that's for another day. But look how a look is de-arousing and can change by looking at this image. It's exactly the same rough-shaven person that you probably would turn the door away from and close the door on them if they turned up and asked you for money. But suddenly now people look at this image and say, that's a person who looks sad. So people's faces, their body language, they all communicate emotion. And quite a lot of the people we work with who are stressed, traumatized, developmentally young, they might be on the spectrum, they might have ADHD, they struggle sometimes reading and pulling together the whole of that body language. You know, it's very chaotic for people to match up what you're saying with how you're behaving. So non-verbal cues are really important. And again, when we say about avoiding human touch, we don't mean saying avoid human touch forever, but we know touch is physiologically very arousing. So you give that person that space. You try not to touch. It's quite interesting at the moment because of the COVID virus, we're actually being asked to social distance and not invade people's spaces. It will be very interesting as well to see how that changes how we interact with people in society long term. I was talking to somebody the other night saying, what if you got into an argument with somebody outside in the street? They're probably going to be too scared to invade your personal space in case to get the virus, right? So something again to think about for the future. Keeping your distance. I tell people this all the time in my work, keep your distance, and they don't. When you're frightened and scared and someone's shouting at you, there's this urge from men and women alike to stand your ground rather than take a few steps back. We run specialist training courses in how to breathe and how to relax in the moment and how to take a few steps back. And believe us, from our experience of training over 250,000 people over the years, we know that this is not easy for people to do. The other thing is also is, and people find this hard, is if you're supporting someone who's distressed, is you avoid entering the space, but you take yourself out of their line of sight as much as possible. Be present, but don't be in the space. Yeah. And that's something that people also find very hard to do because they're also told we have to monitor people very closely. So it creates a paradoxical situation. I know I need to give you space because you're quite distressed or you're quite angry and I need you to calm down, but actually I need to watch you. Something again that people misconstrue in this. The other thing is that gestures are construed very differently for people when they're hyper aroused. And I've got a visual example of this. If I reach out to say touch someone to show them a sign of affection, this is what I may be attending in my mind's eye as an image. I'm going to gently touch someone on the shoulder to say calm down or there, something we all do. But what someone who's frightened or stressed may actually see in their head is this, that they're frightened and scared, that you're going to threaten them, that you're going to grab hold of them. So we need to bear in mind at the time that threat is in the eye of the perceiver often and the receiver. So we need to be clear that sometimes our sudden gestures and our sudden movements can really, really distress people. I remember working in a school setting years ago and just advised people, and they thought I was crazy, just sit down when the child does this. Don't get up and rush towards him. It's more than attention. You're actually increasing stress and arousal. So just sit down. And one of the teachers said to me, yeah, but he paces up and down. Yeah, well, see if you can live with that and be in the moment with it, because you'll appear calmer and I'm sure it will calm him. I'm not saying it was a cure-all, but it certainly helped him in his circumstances, quite astoundingly. And sometimes the message for us is the simple things that you do in the moment in crisis can create the space to communicate and connect with people and develop relationships with them. So I don't want you to think that the be all and end all of Studio 3 and low arousal is just crisis management. It's about creating that space for an individual to meaningfully engage with them, which will take time. I think if I have a mantra is behavior is complicated, not simple. It's complicated, it's complex. It's not as simple as ABCs. Human behavior challenges us all the time. If you look at human behavior now, why would someone who's told don't go out, you will infect other people if you do, they go out? Now it's a minority of people, but sometimes human behavior is almost unfathomable in these circumstances. Big issue, and my colleague Gareth Morwood, who will talk more about this next week because it's one of his favorite issues around classrooms, is have planned escape. If somebody's melting down regularly or they're in distress, what is their area for escape? Now, planned escape can be for you or for the person. Quite often, I look at houses when I'm supporting individuals in schools and actually say, where are your safe areas where people can just run off and burn off steam? I remember working with a school in Denmark years ago when we were doing our training in the early days. And one of the things that struck me about this school, which was designed specifically for children with ADHD, autism, and other conditions, was it had lots of outside space. They had tree houses, they had tents. And actually, when they adopted the low arousal approach, it was like second nature to them anyway, because quite often they were saying to us, well, when a child is looking like they're escalating and they're not learning and their stress is affecting their learning, we just go outside and let them walk it off, and we go with them and we chill out. That's low arousal. It's actually quite an amazing thing to do. We currently, and I'll plug them, we currently have a project with another service called Pinstrup Skolen near Aarhus in Denmark, and they apply these principles almost as a mantra. And we know that things like physical interventions and restraint are almost non-existent in that school, and it's not an accident. It's down to staff changing their responses. It's not a pipe dream, it can be a reality. The last bit I want to talk about has been pejorative over the years. People talk about debriefing. When I first started doing training in the 90s, debriefing was a new word. You must be emotionally debriefed after a situation. I must debrief you. The problem is it has become pejorative. It's become a thing that we do to people and a tick box rather than really the general idea of emotional support. People need emotional support, which takes more than just debriefing. They need their managers to actually say to them, it's okay. They need other people to support them in that. They need somebody sometimes to say, well, look, you know, this will not happen again. And in my book, I talked about how when we're debriefing someone, and I thought of a real life example of somebody that I worked with a few years ago, who was actually pushed down a flight of stairs by a client as he was trying to get out of the way. He was a guy with, you might have used the word borderline personality disorder, high functioning autism, a whole range of conditions. Bipolar was another thing they'd said. But as he rushed past this person, he pushed them out of the way and they fell down a flight of stairs. The client service user rang off in panic. That person was injured and was off work sick for a few days. But she had a fantastic relationship with that individual. And I was amazed to be told that they wanted me to talk to that person to stop them coming back into work too early. And her words to me was, I forgive him. Amazing low arousal practitioner. I genuinely was in the way. I don't believe there was any intent to harm me. And I know he's upset too. That person taught me so much. And that was only a few years ago of thinking, I'm supposed to be an expert in this. Yeah, that is real forgiveness. That is real empathy building and relationship building with someone. But one of the things that I've designed in the book, just as a plug, is that there's a thing that I call a post-incident reaction plan, PERP to some of you people. And it's a set of structured questions that people should ask someone, like a line manager or a friend, which goes beyond just how do you feel to how do you re-engage with this person? Do you want to re-engage with them? How can we do this? Do you carry on as if nothing's ever happened? Sometimes you do. Or do you create a space, a letter where there's some kind of forgiveness that can occur with it? It's very hard to do in practice, but we've decided over the years at Studio 3 to structure this more. And the other thing I always advise people and my colleagues do is when you're stressed and angry or upset, avoid making decisions then. Sometimes I'll see emergency meetings called with people who are very angry, very frightened and scared. And that encourages what I would call rubbish decisions, often that are emotion and driven by the hot, almost limbic parts of our brain, the reptilian parts of our brain. We're not thinking it through. It's quite interesting. The famous psychologist Daniel Kahneman talked about type 1 and type 2 processes in the brain. I encourage you to look at his work. It's in a book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And he basically is mimicking the ideas of measured processes where we're thinking things through logically and emotion-driven processes. I encourage you to read his book. It's an absolutely paralleling how we behave in this kind of area and field. So re-engagement is a big part of the approach. And I think we spend enough time on how do I not have my relationship damaged after something's happened like this? Because if you're going to work with people who are stressed and traumatized, you are going to be exposing yourself to people saying things to you that are quite hurtful. And the deeper your relationship gets with someone, the more hurtful their comments can be. So you have to address those fears and hesitations. And you have to accept in the end that the key thing about the whole approach is it's about us, not them. It's about changing our behavior, not the person who's distressed or appears distressed. Yeah, it's about us, not them. And it's very hard to do in practice. And a reflective practitioner in the low arousal approach, you learn to adapt. It doesn't make you perfect. It makes you fallible. It means you can have good and bad days when you're working with people in this situation. But I also know from our own, concentrate more and more and more on the concept of crisis management and what makes us a low arousal practitioner. It has a knock-on impact into creating cultures where people say no more to restraint, no more to seclusion, no more to certain restrictions. I'm working with someone who's traumatized at the moment, who doesn't need somebody raising their voice to them to be firm. They don't need someone, inadvertently invading their space because they're terrified they're going to be restrained. But the key thing to finish with is that low arousal often requires a change in culture. It requires leadership, not just what you do in the moment. It's no good a member of staff getting good at managing those day-to-day moments if the organization doesn't buy into the approach and the philosophy. That's why my organization is called Studio 3 Training Systems, not Studio 3 will sell you a few training courses and see what happens. So I'm coming to the end now. I'm sorry if I bored people too much with this. But when we're looking at the current COVID crisis, is there something about Studio 3 I need to make you aware of? We have moved literally all of our training online. We are using this as an opportunity to broaden the message, to do low-cost training for families, for example, to run more interactive webinars. We will be running free webinars like this pretty much for every week for the next 6 months and beyond. We'll then have some live interactive training, which is the sort of training we normally do for small groups, which can be done over the Zoom online system, and that's going very well at the moment. And also another element of our approach is ongoing coaching and support for people, because there's no point in training people in these approaches and then hoping that the information sticks. Training is a dialogue. It's a dynamic entity. So often the person who might give you some advice and you apply it to your family or your service, coaching and dialogue is required to actually really move the situation on and to improve our performance. It's a very obvious point, but most organizations in crisis management don't do coaching. They just do training courses and seminars with death by PowerPoint. That's not how we operate. Our next free webinar, and I'm going to announce it now, I'm going to announce the next two actually, is on the 7th of April this time, and it's with my colleague Wood, who is an amazing educator. He's looked after children, he's worked with children with special needs in school settings, and he's been applying our low arousal approach in learning environments. And he's been doing it for years. And I'm proud to say that Gareth joined our team fairly recently, and he has been like a force of nature. So Gareth will be on this next week at the same time. Anyone who signed up to this is very welcome. Please, please, please sign up and listen to different aspects of low arousal in different environments. The week after that, I've been told now I can actually say this, there will be someone that some people in the autism field know quite well, called Peter Vermeulen, a colleague and a friend, and he's agreed to do a seminar on psychoeducation, how you break the news and talk about this thing called autism and other conditions. And that will be in the same format. By next week, we'll have a full program for the next 6 months from all of our practitioners. Well, without much ado, I hope you've enjoyed this element of it. And I want to thank everyone for watching. I really appreciate, and we're all really, really surprised that our target for this first initial talk was maybe 300 to 500 people. And I understand we're close to 1,100 to 1,200 people today. So thank you again